Hello. Today, we're back reading Healing the Child Within, a self-help book from 1984. We're on chapter 5, and I'm going to continue in chapter 5 because it was like 20 pages long, and I'm not going to read for 45 minutes. So this is the second half of chapter 5, which is titled Parental Conditions That Tend to Stifle the Child Within. Here, let's pick up chronic mental illness or disabling chronic physical illness. Chronic mental illness may range from subtle to mild and mild to obvious and disabling. It may include any of the major chronic mental and emotional illnesses listed and described in the DSM-3, Diagnostics and Statistical Manual, 3rd edition, in the American Psychiatric Association. The following is a case history of Barbara, a 56-year-old married woman with 4 children and a professional career. Barbara? 4 years ago, I finally went for help. I had been depressed since my early childhood. In therapy, I learned that my mother had been chronically depressed most of her life. I remember a time in my mid-20s when she got me a date with a man with whom she was having an affair. Weird. While she was still married to and was living with my father. I felt really bad about going out with him. My father had been cold and distant from both me and my mother. Later, what the fuck? Later, what is this word that it has here? WHER. Later, my mother was hospitalized from taking an overdose of sleeping pills. I learned that my father had been impotent for most of their marriage. That was a family secret, of course. I viewed my father's distance and mother's chronic depression as my fault, as long as I can remember, and I felt a lot of shame and guilt over it. I survived as a child by being obedient, doing well in school, and focusing on my mother. I took a caretaker role. As a teenager, I went to the library and read everything I could on psychology in the attempt to cure my mother and father. In my recovery and psychotherapy and my self-reflection, I learned that I was fused with my mother, and that our boundaries were so merged that I literally woke up every morning and didn't know how I felt until I looked at how my mother was feeling. Weird, but I can imagine that. I also learned that my father's coldness and distance had nothing to do with how good a little girl I was or how hard I worked, but it had to do with him. I learned that I no longer had to be a victim. Since then, I have been feeling better overall, and my life is going better. I continue to work on getting free of my old problems. By reaching for help, Barbara came to recognize the damage done to her true self by growing up in a troubled family, and is now well on her way to recovery. Extreme rigidity, punitiveness, judgmentalness, non-loving, perfectionism, and inadequacy. Although many people's true self has been substantially stifled, an exact nature of trouble in the family cannot be easily recognized or labeled. For example, recognizing advanced alcoholism in family members may be relatively easy because it's so blatant, but recognizing less obvious conditions is more difficult. I have observed and treated hundreds of adult children of alcoholics, other chemical dependents, and codependents during long-term recovery. I have also seen several other patients who fit the description of children of addicts, both by diagnosis and by their own observations. Yet they did not come from an alcoholic, codependent, or obviously codependent family, nor from any of the other obvious parental conditions listed in Table 3. I don't know what CD means. I thought it meant codependent, but it doesn't because they said codependent right after. Whatever. Kathy was 32 years old, a 32-year-old woman who grew up in a troubled family. There were no alcoholics in the family, yet she joined an experience growth and therapy group for adult children of alcoholics. She represents an increasing number of adult children troubled by dysfunctional families, or adult children of trauma, whose background, life, and suffering are more similar than dissimilar to those of adult children of alcoholics. When she was about midway in her recovery, she wrote the following about her life. My parents espoused the "what will people think" philosophy. In public, we really did pull off the perfect family image, where we were all very gracious to each other. At home, Mom and Dad changed from smiling, chatting, joking, to Dad completely withdrawing physically, verbally, and emotionally, and Mom yelling for attention. I always had a feeling of preparing for or getting ready for something. Always a flurry of household chores to get through. I felt happiness when I was in the midst of a chore. I had a role, and I learned early to try to bottle tension by anticipating what needed to be done next. To make it easier for Mom, I consciously worked at not needing anything from anyone again to hopefully cut down on some of my stress. Dad was either never home or sleeping whenever he was at home. He may as well have stayed away. I didn't recall any interactions with him other than at a distance, being afraid of him, though he was never verbally or physically abusive. I grew up in a neutral feeling for my dad and a very strong emotions for my mom, taking care of her by not being a bother, by not giving her any trouble, by anticipating how she would want me to be. This later developed into a strong emotional hating her for a distance she fostered between Dad and me. For most of my adult life, we've wavered between pleasing her and being very rebellious around her, rebellious around her wishes for me. Being the fifth of 6 children, I have a strong memory that Dad didn't know which one I was at times. He was a workaholic outside of the home. Mom was very compulsive about things in the home. I'm now trying to get in touch with some of my feelings about my dad. I remember quietly living in my home, hoping no one saw me, while at the same time craving anyone's attention. I was always overweight and always tried to lose the weight, trying to hide because of how I looked. I continued my quiet life throughout high school, feeling very protected and safe whenever I was at home. I had a feeling of not wanting to be away from the house. I wasn't like my siblings who went out for sports, drama, speech, etc. This pattern continued in college. I didn't have a safe, protected place to be on campus, and my weight became a big problem. I was not developing in the direction with my life that I intended. 3 colleges ended up with a 2-year degree. My adult life became mere survival. I didn't have the capacity to form and maintain relationships. I broke up with any man I was seeing. I moved out on roommates. I left jobs after starting having personality problems with bosses. I kept away from my family on an unconscious level. I became bulimic to control weight gains. I dated men opposite from those Mom would approve. I began smoking and drinking as a sign of independent thinking. Independent thinking is what it says. I was chronically depressed, isolating, and compulsively overeating or dieting. I wanted people to think I had it all together and didn't need anything from anyone. But inside, I was so needy that whenever I did have a friend, I expected to be fulfilled from that one person. I came into Overeaters Anonymous 3.5 years ago, devastated from my binge and purge cycles, and I have been abstinent for a year now. I started attending Alcoholics Anonymous, or ACOA therapy. I'm not sure what ACOA therapy group, feeling I fit this group just like I fit into Overeaters Anonymous. These people were just like me, and I was a lot like them. But I quickly started ACOA group therapy over a year ago, and I have attended on a weekly basis. For 6 months, I didn't feel any emotions, or at least I couldn't identify any. But I was exposed to group members experiencing feelings about their current issues and identity, and re-experiencing incidents in the past that were too painful to feel before. I began to be willing to risk these people knowing me, motivated largely by the desire to stay abstinent from overeating. I began developing a sense of the group representing a safe family on which to develop and to begin to re-experience what I didn't get in my own family. I began to have some honest interactions, even though I was afraid of not feeling worthy of the group time, of undivided attention from the group. But I was slowly getting a growing sense of self-esteem from real, honest interactions, and in and out of group. I was open to acknowledging that I have feelings to identify them, and finally expressing them to be able to feel my healing. I let go of destructive patterns and relationships and in how I see myself. I was finding inherent worth in my simply being. I talked about what it was like growing up in a home where I felt invisible. Telling the truth as I perceived it has been incredibly freeing for me. Being honest with myself has been a chore or a core of recovery. Awfully difficult to do since I came into therapy with no sense of self. I discovered that for me, it takes time to even get an inkling that I have a right to myself. It has taken time and a lot of facing my feelings and constructing a healthy self one day at a time through Overeaters Anonymous and group therapy. The families or other family-like environments for which Kathy's story serves as an example fit many of the dynamics described below. If the troubled or dysfunctional family, some common parental conditions include extreme rigidity, extreme punitiveness, judgmentalness, perfectionism, and a cold, non-loving relationship with children and other family members. The parents were inadequate to administer to the mental, emotional, and spiritual needs of the child. These states or conditions are often extremely insidious, subtle, or hidden. They may be difficult to recognize without some substantial recovery work in self-help groups, group therapy, individual counseling, or in other forms of introspection by sharing with the listening or trusted others. Outwardly, these families are usually not viewed as being troubled or dysfunctional. Indeed, they often are viewed as being healthy. This category of troubled or dysfunctional family is open for observation, exploration, and research. Child abuse: physical, sexual, mental, emotional, and/or spiritual. Child abuse is common in all sorts of troubled families. While severe physical abuse and overt sexual abuse are clearly recognizable as traumatic to infants and children, other forms of child abuse may be more difficult to recognize as being abusive. This may include mild to moderate physical abuse, covert or less obvious sexual abuse, mental and emotional abuse, child neglect, and ignoring or thwarting a child's spirituality or spiritual growth. Examples of covert or more subtle sexual abuse includes a parent's flirting, relating sexual experiences, stories, or jokes, touching children, adolescents, or even adult children in inappropriate parts of the anatomy, and any other unnecessary sexually stimulating behavior. These forms of abuse usually result in deep-seated feelings of intense guilt and shame that are unconsciously carried into adulthood. I will address emotional abuse in more detail later. Spiritual abuse is likely to be controversial, rarely discussed, yet real. For example, raising a child to be an atheist or cultist may seem like spiritual abuse to some parents, but not to others. More subtle forms taught by some organized religions are strong teachings of an angry deity, inflicting guilt or shame, or insisting that certain other denominations or belief systems are automatically bad or inferior. It's fair. While the latter may be easily observed in some fundamentalist Christian denominations, they are by no means limited to these, since such characteristics pervade many of our world's religious systems. Indeed, these views are often major factors starting and continuing the many wars that have been fought around the world. Other conditions stifle the true self. Some examples may be found under the post-traumatic stress disorder discussed in Chapter 7. Some commonalities. These 7 parental conditions often exist in mixtures among troubled families. The stifling of the child within, or the use, perhaps stronger language. The murder of a child's soul. Whoa. By Schatzman in 1973. He said the murder of the child's soul is any of these forms of abuse. Has certain common dynamics with the family. These may include inconsistency, unpredictability, arbitrariness, and chaos. Inconsistency and unpredictability tend to repress spontaneity and are generally crazy-making. Combined with arbitrariness, the dynamics may promote lack of trust or fear of abandonment, as well as chronic depression. They result in chaotic environment. This precludes the development of a safe, secure, and reliable foundation from which to learn about ourselves through risk-taking. While many of these characteristics of troubled or dysfunctional families are common, all may not be present in every troubled family. Okay. Inconsistent. Many troubled families are inconsistent and some are not. One way that many troubled families are consistent is through consistently denying the feelings of many family members and having one or more family secrets. Troubled families that are rigid tend to be more consistent and predictable. Because they are excessive, these qualities function to control and shut down family and individual growth. Unpredictable. Many troubled families are predictable in their unpredictability. That is, family members learn that they can expect the unexpected at any time. By contrast, many will know what to predict and even when to predict it, although they may not know it consciously or talk about it with others. However, they usually live in chronic fear, as though walking on eggshells, of when they will suffer the next trauma. Arbitrary. The arbitrariness means that no matter who the family member is or how hard they may try, the troubled person or persons would still mistreat them in the same way. In a family where rules have no rhyme or reason, A child loses trust in the rule setter or parent and in him or herself. She is unable to understand the environment. However, while the more rigid families may be less arbitrary, they still can be troubled and painful and dysfunctional, and they are often arbitrary about their rigidity. I'd say what I'm reading right now so far is making some sense. Chaotic. Chaos may be manifested by any of the following. 1. Physical and emotional abuse, which teaches the child shame, guilt, and don't feel. 2. Sexual abuse, which teaches the same, plus distrust and fearing of losing control. 3. Regular and repeated crises, which teach a crisis orientation of life. 4. Predictable closed communication, which teaches don't talk, don't be real, and denial. 5. Loss of control, which teaches obsession with being in control and fusion of or loss of boundaries or individuation. While dysfunctional families tend to be chaotic in many troubled families, chaos is either absent or minimal. Here, chaos is often subtle in its manifestation. Active or overt chaos does not have to be present to stifle our child within. Rather, just the threat of chaos, whether it to be threat of crisis, threat of mistreatment or any form, or threat of seeing another family member mistreated, no matter how simple or transient, can be just as creative, just as damaging. It does so by instilling a fear which blocks our being real and creative. When we cannot be real and creative, we cannot discover, explore, and complete our stories, and thereby grow and develop. We cannot have peace. Even if active chaos occurs only once or twice a year, the threat of its unpredictability, impulsiveness, and destructiveness to the self and others is enough to chronically destroy peace and serenity. The family members in the middle of chaos, whether active or threatened, may feel that there is so routine and so normal that he or she does not recognize it as chaos. This principle is true of all of the characteristics in this chapter. Mistreatment. Child mistreatment in various forms can be subtle, though clearly damaging and to growth, development, and aliveness of our true self. Examples are listed in Table 5. Denial of feelings and reality. Troubled families tend to deny feelings, especially in painful feelings of its members. The child and many of the adults are not allowed to express feelings, especially so-called negative ones, such as anger. However, each family usually has at least one member, generally an alcoholic or similarly troubled person, who is permitted to express painful feelings openly, especially anger. Some terms, Table 5, some terms for mental, emotional, and spiritual trauma that may be experienced by children and adults. Abandonment, neglect, abuse, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual. Shaming, humiliating, degrading, inflicting guilt, criticizing, disgracing, joking about. I'm not going to read all these. In such families, unless you want me to, put it in the comments if you want me to read Table 5. If you want me to read Table 5, even if you comment this in 2026, as the Context Media Network is burgeoning, I'll go back and I'll read it, if I can find the book. Maybe I'll just show it, and I'll see if I can read it from here, if I can't find it. There you go. In such families where anger and chronic unexpression directly by members often takes other forms, abuse of self, others, and other antisocial behaviors, and various forms of acute and chronic illness, including stress-related illness, What the child sees as reality is denied, and a new model, view of self, belief system, is often binds the family together in a further dysfunctional way. This denial and the new belief system stifle and retard the child's development and grow in the crucial mental and emotional spiritual areas of life, according to Brown. To repeat, while discovering some of the conditions described here may feel uncomfortable, it can start the way out of our suffering and confusion. We can summarize the common characteristics of troubled or dysfunctional families as including at least one, although usually severe of the following: neglectful, mistreating, inconsistent, unpredictable, arbitrary, denying; having one or more secrets, disallowing feelings, disallowing other needs; rigid, chaotic at times, quiet and functional at times. Other characteristics of troubled families may include a variety of neglect and mistreatment. Reading about and reflecting upon examples of mistreatment or trauma can help us find our true self. Also helping is hearing others tell their stories of mistreatment or trauma. But one of the best ways to begin validating our own mistreatment is trauma is to tell our own story in the company of people who accept and support us and who will not betray our confidence or reject us. I call such people safe and supportive, and describe these principles of in the following chapters. What other factors or dynamics inhibit our child within? In the next chapter, I focus on the development of low self-esteem, the shame dynamic and negative rule, negative affirmation or messages. And the next chapter begins tomorrow. Chapter 6. Thank you. God bless. Have a good day. Enjoy your weekend. Or your weekday, depending when you listen.